Please be seated. The court is now back in session, and we will hand the floor to Nunti's defense to put the questions to this expert. You can proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Your Honours Counsel. Good afternoon, Mrs. Becker. I've listened with great interest to your answers. I have some more questions, as you might imagine. My first questions would be to know a little bit more about your book. Your book was published in 1998, the second edition. 1998, yes. And the first edition was 1986. Would you be able to tell us when you did your last primary research? That is to say, your last interview with one of the people involved in that period?
It would have been in 1990. I think 94, around the early 90s.
Would it be possible July 92? Is that in your book?
Yes. If that's in the book, yes.
Did you do what exactly did you do between, let's say, that last interview in 92 and the actual publication of your book in 1998?
I was a full-time reporter and editor.
No, I mean in relation to your book, did you do any...
Yes, I did freelance articles and, freelance articles directly about Cambodia, freelance articles and occasional... I went to Cambodia in 1995. Was my previous trip to Cambodia before the book was 1995.
Did you do any substantial research after the second edition of your book on Cambodia, or more specifically the period of decay?
You mean since 1998?
Correct.
Secondary, not... I have come back to do interviews, but it's largely about this particular contemporary Cambodia. And that sometimes bled into democratic Kampuchea.
Well, would it be a fair summary of me to say that the bulk of your primary research was before the publication of the first publication, the first print in 1986, and then some research up until 92, 98? Would that be correct?
The bulk would be by 1992, yes.
Would it then be fair to say that you haven't done major research for, let's say, the past 23 years, 22 years? On the topic, obviously.
Major, no. but I've kept up with secondary.
The reason I'm asking you is I have noticed that some possibly important secondary literature is not in your book. Partly, no, not mainly because it's post-1998. I'm referring to two books. One book from an American scholar, Stephen Morris, who extensively used material from Soviet archives, and a more recent book from a Cambodian journalist together with an American journalist, Ted Sambat. Have you read these books?
I know Sambat's movie, certainly, and in fact I nominated him for an award. And of course I know Stephen Morris's work. I've known it for a long time. But I can't say that I can remember his recent book that well.
Well, his recent book is from 1999, so per definition you couldn't have incorporated that book in your book.
Wasn't your question whether or not I'd read it?
Sorry, whether you incorporated his book into your book. Yes, we're speaking English, that's why I go faster than normal. I will slow down. I'm sorry. The other thing that I have noticed in your book is, and maybe I'm wrong, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's relatively little literature coming from China, or either secondary literature or primary sources indicating the Chinese perspective on what happened in DK. Would that be correct?
I don't think that's accurate. In fact, a recent book by Andrew Murtha on the Chinese in democratic Kampuchea, which was published in the last year or two, begins with a quote from me and quotes me extensively on the Chinese role in democratic Kampuchea.
I could give you one concrete example. I went through your book and I haven't seen any reference to a secret report which is public from January 1979, drafted by Geng Biao, and basically portraying the view of China on what happened during DK. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
President Council Coupe, please wait, and Judge Levin, you have the floor.
Council Coupe, for some time now, you've been asking questions such as why the expert hasn't taken certain documents into account, or why she didn't mention documents that were published in her book. The problem is that we do not know exactly when the documents you are referring to were published. If you are referring to a specific document, could you please give us the references of those documents and the dates on which they were published? Otherwise, we will not be able to ascertain the relevance of your questions.
I was actually going to refer to that document later on in my questionnaire, but I'm very happy to do it now. I'm referring to a document E307/5.2.1. ERN, there's only the English ERN, I'm afraid, 01001 620, and it's called Geng Biao's Report on the Situation of the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. And it was put on the case file by a request of our team.
Mais quand a
But when was it published? Because if you want to ask questions as to why it wasn't mentioned in Mrs. Becker's book, we need to know when it was published.
Yes, Judge Lavergne, in the opening paragraph of that report, it says the following document was released by Taiwanese intelligence sources and was published in January 1981 by Issues and Studies in Taipei. So it is a document from 1981 referred to by Nayan Chanda in his book and also referred to by Stephen Morris in his book. And to be complete, Nayan Chanda's book is, I think, in the same year written as the first edition of Madame Becker's book. Another question, Ms. Becker, is a follow-up question from the prosecution on the use by you of earlier scholarly work, Kiernan, Chandler, Heder. I wrote down in my notes that at one point you said in an answer that among the group you shared a lot. Would you be able to expand a little bit on what you mean that you shared a lot?
Well, if someone was working on an issue and they knew someone else had documents, we would share them.
Would you be able to say that you relied more on one scholar or the other, or is that very difficult for you to say?
Well, for instance, Nayan Chanda and I shared a lot because he was a Vietnam scholar and I was a Vietnam reporter and I was a Cambodia reporter. So we shared an awful lot on Nayan wrote on the diplomatic history, and he was very much on diplomatic history. So I shared with Nayan. With Ben Kiernan, he found the documents about the murder of Malcolm Caldwell. He shared that with me. Stephen Heder was excellent on translating Khmer Rouge documents. David Hawke, I mentioned David, he was one of the first to put the collections of photographs together, and so he would bring things to me to go over. It depended on the subject.
Thank you. Going back to an earlier question from the prosecution, on your contacts with officials, for instance, from the State Department just prior to your trip to DK. In that context, have you spoken to an analyst of the State Department, a person with the name of Douglas Pike?
Douglas Pike is much more a Vietnam expert, and I did not talk to him before my DK trip.
Have you used a report that he had written for U.S. Congress in the fall of '78 for your book?
I certainly talked to the members of Congress who wrote the report, yes, and talked to them, but not to Douglas Pike.
But my question was, do you remember whether you actually used his report to write certain chapters of your book?
Yes, I read it, and it's one of the secondary, yes, 1978 report of the Congress, yes.
No, the reason I'm asking is because I didn't find it in the reference. But what else can you tell us about Douglas Pike other than that he was the specialist on Vietnam?
His regular biography, I do not know him well.
Then moving on to another American journalist, Richard Dutman. You spoke about him already before. Would it be correct if I describe him as in that period, 78, as a very experienced journalist?
He was a very experienced journalist on U.S. foreign policy.
I believe he's 96 years old now. I think he's still alive. What else would you be able to tell us about his qualities as a journalist?
He has a good reputation, as I wrote in the book. His major journalism career was in Washington, covering the State Department and making occasional trips with U.S. foreign officials.
I've Googled him, and I've seen that he won a George Polk Lifetime Achievement Award in 1993. Would you be able to tell us what exactly that award implies?
It is an award to a reporter who does dangerous assignments, and 1978 Cambodia proved to be very dangerous.
Is it a prestigious award?
Yes.
I would like to talk a little bit more about Richard Dutman. I'm not quite sure if that was sent to you. I would like to discuss with you an article, or rather an op-ed, that he wrote in the New York Times on August 17, 1990. Mr. President, that would be E307/5.2.16. There's only, I'm afraid, in English ERN 01002091. My first question to you, have you read his op-ed?
Yes.
Do you have any general comments on that op-ed he wrote?
Oh, I disagree with it.
Would you be able to explain with what you disagree and why?
By 1990, when it was published, all of the Tuol Sleng had been open for years. The evidence was clear, and Dick had retired. He'd never gone back to Cambodia since December 1978, and I like and admire Dick, and I was sorry to see that he wrote that, because the evidence was the contrary.
If you allow me, I'll read just 2 or 3 passages from that article, more to know more specifically what he is saying. The title of the article, I'm not sure if that is coming from him, is Pol Pot brutal, yes, but no mass murderer. And he opens this article by saying the following. Blind hatred of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge is pushing the US towards policy changes that could well contribute to the ultimate destruction of Cambodia as an independent society through conquest by Vietnam. He then, I'll skip a few paragraphs, he then moves on to say, and I quote again, before we abandon the opposition coalition, we should take another look at the men we love to hate, at the conventional wisdom that Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge are irrational fanatics who practiced deliberate genocide, slaughtered more than 1 million Cambodians, and wrecked the Cambodian society and economy. The evidence for these fixed beliefs consists mainly of poignant, though statistically inconclusive anecdotes and extrapolation from accounts of mass executions in a few villages. It comes mostly from those with an interest in blackening the name of the Khmer Rouge, from Cambodian refugees, largely the middle and upper class victims of the Pol Pot revolution, and from the Vietnamese who long ago annexed much of Cambodia and now covered the rest. Excuse me, what would be your reaction on these two paragraphs?
That his ideas are entirely out of date, that he doesn't even mention all of the archives that were uncovered after the Vietnamese invasion, that there was no question. The reason we're having this trial right now is the evidence is overwhelming. And as I said, I really like Dick and I admire him, and I'm very sorry to see he wrote that, because the evidence is this was an incompetent, murderous regime.
Thank you. Then he moves on, and then that's my last quote from this specific article. He moves on to a very brief summary of his bigger report from 1979, January. And if you allow me, I quote again. So he talks about his visit, and he says, still, the information I had received in advance was mostly misleading. Observing many hundreds of Cambodians, too many I judged to have been arranged for my benefit, I saw a generally healthy population, a normal demographic mix of men, women and children, including babies in arms, and yes, many nursing mothers. I looked in vain for distended bellies and dull brownish hair. Working hours, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., were not unreasonable for the harvest season. A natural rubber factory, a pharmaceutical plant, and a textile mill appeared to be operating efficiently. Rice exports had resumed on a modest scale, as confirmed later by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'll move on to more details in his report, but that is his 1990 sort of very short summary of his visit. What would be your initial reaction to this paragraph in his article?
That this is what we call single source reporting, that when you go simply to a country and you allow government officials to make your itinerary, to define who you talk to and who you do not talk to, and do not allow you any freedom of movement at all, that is single sourcing, and that's not complete journalism, and I disagree, as you know.
I would like to put before you a passage from a dissertation written in 1990 by a Dutch academic. It's a book called The Eyes of the Pineapple. It's written by Roel Bergler. Mr. President, it's the E3 number, or no, sorry, the E30715.2.17 is the relevant number, and the ERN that I'm specifically referring to is 01002473. I'm afraid there's no French or Khmer ERN yet. It's a footnote on page 352, and in this footnote he explains how he has analyzed and researched the various reports of delegations and visitors to DK in 1978. And the footnote reads as follows. I will quote Dutman, in my opinion, the most critically insightful of the visitors, extensively. And then he goes on to say, see also Becker, 79, Ito, 78, Stanic, 78, etc., etc. What would be your reaction to this scholar's categorizing, as you will, of his reporting in relation to the other reporting, including yourself?
Well, as much as I don't like to be drawn in, I'm not going to criticize Dudman as a human being, but my book is quoted extensively, and I'm quite confident that my reporting has been quoted extensively.
Thank you. I would like now to...
President Council Coupe, please wait, and Judge Laverne, you have the floor.
Yes, Council Coupe, unless I'm mistaken, I didn't hear who is the author of the book that you're referring to.
The author, Judge Laverne, is a scholar called Roel Burglar, and his book is titled The Eyes of the Pineapple. It's published at the University of Nijmegen. Ms. Becker, I would like now to move on to the report that Richard Dutman actually wrote right after his visit to DK together with you and Malcolm Caldwell. These are more detailed quotes, and I would read a few, and I would like to have your specific comments, if that's all right with you. I would like to start, Ms. Becker, with, I'm referring, excuse me, Mr. President, to E3/3290. The English ERN is 004192007. There are no French or Khmer ERNs. My first quote is on page 3, in the first column, and it reads as follows, Ms. Becker. While the visit amounted to a conducted tour with strict limits on conversations with ordinary Cambodians and no opportunity to speak with any but a few top government officials, there was plenty of opportunity for observation in tours of 11 of the 19 provinces. A little further on that same page, he says, and I quote, despite the restrictions the Cambodians place on our activities, we were able to gather significant information about the new Cambodia for the first time since the communist victory of almost 4 years ago. Would you agree with that observation?
I agree that we were heavily restricted. And I know I disagree on what he considers opportunities for observations. We were, as I said, we went through a lot of provinces, but we were stuck in the car most of the time or in boats. That's enough.
On this specific topic, did you ever speak to him afterwards when he published this article?
Not only did we speak to each other, we debated each other regularly on television.
Was that in 1979? I'll move on to a next quote. That is a page later, ERN 004-19208, same document. He says, at the same time, the physical condition of life may well have improved for many peasants and former urban workers, possibly for the vast majority of the population, as the regime claimed. He goes on to write, the new communist Cambodia became one huge work camp, but its people clearly were not being worked to death and starved to death, as foreign critics often charged. What I found in 2 weeks of touring Pol Pot's Cambodia, under strict government supervision, but with good opportunity for observation, was a regimented life of hard work for most Cambodians, lengthened, however, by much improved housing, regular issue of clothing, and an assurance of apparently adequate food. I did not find the grim picture painted by the thousands of refugees who couldn't take the new order and fled to Thailand or Vietnam. Workers usually appear to be operating under their own direction. There was no sign of government cadres giving orders or armed guards enforcing the working hours, although individuals seemed to know what was expected. That would be sort of the first set of quotes from his report, January 79. Would you be willing to comment on these observations?
Yes. The major disagreement between Richard Dudman and I was that he did not know Cambodia before. So when he made statements, this is improved housing, this is better clothing, he's comparing it to nothing. He had been in Cambodia once before when he was captured by Vietnam, by the Vietnamese soldiers. He had not been to Cambodia before. So we regularly had discussions all through that, Richard, this is not improved. You had to know this is not at all. We just went to a couple of model places. What you see is, Potemkin village, and even that is not improved. And we did see armed guards. We were stopped. Every time we tried to do something, we were stopped, and often by armed guards. So, disagreement.
Then I'll move on with some more quotes. The next page, Mr. President, ERN 004-19209, and I quote again, at 11 a.m., the midday break began, and the farm workers headed for lunch at one of the huge new communal dining halls. Afterward, many could be seen relaxing or taking naps in hammocks, slung under the houses on stilts. Work resumed at 1 p.m. There could be no doubt that quitting time was 5 p.m. Wherever we were in the country, men, women and children began filing out of the paddies at that hour to bathe in an irrigation canal, wash clothes, or tend household vegetable plots, and then head for the dining hall once more. Officials said the harvest sometimes required night work, too, when the moon was full, but we saw no work in the fields after dark. And a little further on that same page, one of Cambodia's biggest achievements in these 3+ years was its housing program. And he goes on to speak about the housing program. And then on the same page again, Ms. Becker, he says, and I quote, "I saw no evidence of starvation, however. My observation of hundreds of ordinary Cambodians suggested that they got an adequate diet, if a plain one." Disregarding such stage setting, the stage setting that you spoke about as well, I could tell the state of nutrition by the common sight of playful small children, sometimes running about naked in dooryards in the hot tropical sunshine, with none of the listlessness of protruding bellies that bespeak starvation or malnutrition. I saw many pregnant and nursing women who appeared to be in good health. The sight seemed to refute reports by some refugees that life is so austere that most women have become barren and mother's milk had gone dry. And finally, Mrs. Becker, the next page, 00419210, the ERN. U.S. specialists have acknowledged that the Cambodian claim of reviving rice production to the point of resuming export would, if true, be a spectacular achievement. Again, my question would be to you, if you would like to comment on these specific observations.
We were never allowed after dark. We often weren't around after 5 p.m. We couldn't make those observations. The housing, I'm not sure what he's talking about. The house, we saw few houses on stilts, the new ones, but the housing was not as good as what it was before. The hundreds we saw doesn't begin to reflect the millions. And as I say, we already knew about rice exports because it was required. We actually saw the ships. So that does not in all diminish what I said, that we did not see proof of any of that. It was too narrow.
I'll move on to the next topic, Ms. Beck, but it's somehow still puzzles me. Richard Gutman was already covering the Cuban Revolution and the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He was a very, very experienced journalist. Yet there seem to be substantial differences between his observations and your observations. You said that you had debates on this in '79. Were you able to establish why there are such discrepancies in your observations?
Yes, exactly what I said. He did not know Cambodia before, and I did. And subsequently, he did not want to go back to Cambodia. And it's just simply, it's not the first time this has happened.
I understand your answer, but observing if children are malnourished or generally are looking unhealthy, or these are observations that don't need any prior visit to Cambodia or any prior knowledge of Cambodia. Would you agree with me?
We did not see evidence that there were no malnourished children in Cambodia. We in fact saw, and we took pictures of children who were very thin, and you couldn't tell. We weren't close enough to be able to see nourishment or not nourishment. So no, we just didn't see that.
Very well. I might come back to that point. I would like to move on, Ms. Becker, to the earlier mentioned Douglas Pike and the report that he wrote before Congress in October '78. And with this report in hand, I'm actually moving to my next topic, and that would be the position of Vietnam, the role of Vietnam in relation to decay and in general Southeast Asia. He wrote this report at the request, as I understand, from Congress. It seems that he is reflecting the position and the views of the State Department in those days. And it's a very interesting report, I have to say. And one of the things that he is saying in his conclusions is the following, and I would like to quote that and then ask for your reaction. Mr. President, this is document E3/2370. I'm referring to English ERN 00187396, and it seems there's only a French translation. That is French ERN 003-44747. And it's just a few of the conclusions that he is making before Congress in that report. The first conclusion is the following, and I quote Dr. Spike. Vietnamese communists long have regarded the Federation of Indochina as the proper ultimate political configuration for the peninsula. Of necessity, this would require Cambodian and Laotian acquisitions, or at least find rulers in the two countries who are amenable to the idea. In creating a federation of Indochina, the Vietnamese are in no hurry. That's the first part of his conclusions. I'm moving a little slower because of the translation. The second would be, and I quote again, the present border war, which is actually internecine communist conflict, has been going on since at least 1970. Neither side can be condemned as instigator. Neither is simply a victim. He goes on then to say in his conclusions, and I quote again, Cambodian behavior in the war is not as irrational as it appears. There is a logic both to Cambodian strategy and rhetoric, particularly when viewed in the light of Cambodian history. And the last part of his conclusion I would like to put before you, Ms. Becker, is the following, and I quote, the most likely future of the war appears, as of this moment, to be indeterminate. That is, a debilitating, inconclusive rise and fall in the level of battle. The second most likely outcome, Cambodia firmly turned into a client state, is an attractive prospect for Vietnam, but one fraught with dangers. Now, I apologize, these are many quotes from his conclusions at once, but since you are an expert on the matter, I'm sure you'll be able to put them all together and give your reaction to his conclusions.
The President, hold on, expert. Mr. Co-Prosecutor, you may proceed.
Your Honor, in the introduction to Mr. Kope's question, he made certain representations about this document, and he said it reflected the views of the United States Department of State. That clearly is incorrect, and neither the witness, Your Honors, or the public should be misled about that. If one looks at the forward, it indicates this study was prepared by Douglas Pike, who was a Foreign Service officer on detail as a scholar in residence to another organization, the Congressional Research Service. The findings expressed are those of Mr. Pike and do not necessarily reflect the views of the members of the Committee of International Relations. So this is not a document reflecting the views of the Department of State. And the document itself looking at it in the key findings of Mr. Pike on Vietnam and Cambodia, in page 6, cites two sources, Q Sampan and an official document from the government archives of the Democratic Kampuchea. So those were the sources Mr. Pike used for this report.
As I understand, Mr. Pike is a very senior analyst used to work for the State Department. He's also a professor of history at Berkeley, I believe. Afterwards, he's dead now. The quote that I just heard refers to that it is not the opinion or views of House of Congress. It doesn't say anything whether he represents the State Department, yes or no. Anyway, we're talking with an expert, and I'm sure Mrs. Becker is able to answer my questions.
Thank you. The back and forth about Indo-Chinese Federation and Vietnamese intentions is rich, and it's old, and it continues today. Douglas Pike, when he was in the Foreign Service, was one of the key architects of the theory of the domino theory that propelled the United States to war, that in fact had Vietnam not invading Cambodia, but invading non-communist Southeast Asia. So this is a very rich and constant history. I, of course, write extensively about it and show the different seams in it. So there's not anything one way or the other. And the predictions of the State Department at that point, because I did go to them, was not either of the things that Mr. Pike mentions in his own capacity, but the State Department told me and Mr. Dudman just before we left that they suspected the Vietnamese would stop at the East Bank and then retreat, simply to tell the Cambodians to stop. The latest things on the Indo-Chinese Federation are done in a Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Embers of War, which shows the Chinese and the Soviet communist interest in the Indochina Federation, that they would rather have it, and they would rather have Ho Chi Minh do that in order that they wouldn't have to deal with all three of them. So it's rich and it continues, and there are more and more documents coming out.
I'm coming to the Soviet Union perspective and the Chinese perspective a little bit later. But my question is, do I understand from you that you do not necessarily agree with the conclusions that I read to you on the content?
You read a lot. He predicted a couple of things. One, two, Cart A, Cart B, Cart C. That the one thing that stuck out was that Cambodia is not irrational, and the presumption being that there is rationality on either side. And we all have pointed out that this border war has been going on since 1970. I mean, there's nothing new in what he said.
Let's then, you're right, there are many conclusions that I read to you, but let's then take it step by step. Vietnamese communists long have regarded the Federation of Indochina as the proper ultimate political configuration for the peninsula. Now, is that a conclusion that he draws, which in your opinion is a correct one or is a false one?
Oh, I don't think that's a static idea at all, and I'm not sure that he could even say it then. As I said, no one seriously believed that the Vietnamese were fighting their war in order to take over Cambodia. At that point, that the ultimate is Indo-Chinese Federation, I don't think you can say that, no.
But if you rightfully say that Douglas Pike was instrumental in his formulation of the domino theory, then surely he wasn't an unknowing liberal, but he was somebody with possibly conservative views. And so my question is why he wrote this in 78. reflecting on his knowledge of policy of Vietnam in the beginning of the 70s, why would he be wrong and why would you be right?
That he thinks that he didn't prove it. I'm saying he didn't prove it, and he did not prove it.
Well, the academics or scholars who can actually prove it, maybe, would receive high prices for uncovering material, because it's all, it seems, buried in the archives of Vietnam itself, possibly. So it's very difficult at this stage, even now, to uncover it. But the question is the likeliness of
The President, Judge Fan, you may proceed.
We generally appreciate if you don't testify but ask questions.
I agree, but I'm in a debate with an expert, so sometimes it's difficult not to. What about the other conclusions of Douglas Pike? For instance, the question whether Cambodia, DK, behaved irrational or not vis-a Vietnam.
Oh, I think the war proved that their foreign policy did not make sense. I think they should not have instigated that. And the whole Pol Pot interview I had with Richard Dudman was the model for irrationality, the idea that he actually built his foreign policy, his war policy, on the notion that Warsaw Pact was going to join Vietnam and NATO was going to join Cambodia. That's the model of irrationality.
Well, I was coming to that topic, but now that you mention it, didn't Vietnam enter into a military aid agreement with the Soviet Union, and weren't there Soviet military advisors in DK in Vietnam prior to the invasion? Possibly also East German military advisors.
Yes, in fact, I mentioned that the Soviet-Vietnam agreement was one of the big temperature risers for the Sino-Soviet split. There's no question that agreement was critical. And yes, there were Soviet advisors in Vietnam and Chinese advisors in DK. But the idea that we'd see Warsaw Pact troops and NATO troops.
Coming back to the NATO troops that you mentioned yesterday, can you point me to any DK publication, any DK document, especially the black paper, any FIBIS report that says that Pol Pot or DK thought that NATO troops would come to join their fight? And on top of this, why didn't you mention this seemingly erratic detail in your report, nor did Dudman?
First of all, it was so irrational that it was taken out of my report. I have no idea. The editors took it out. You have the recording of Pol Pot saying that. I gave it to the trial. I can't answer for Richard Dudman.
What about the publications, the black paper?
That was by the Foreign Ministry given out before we went to see Pol Pot. You'll have to ask DK on that one.
Oh, I checked the black paper, and there is no mention of NATO troops. Would it be possible that this whole NATO thing was a bit lost in translation?
No. Did you listen to the recording? I gave it to the court.
No, but I'm saying not lost in translation, but maybe the translator who was translating it didn't understand it properly, and as sometimes happens here, it was conveyed to you in a way that didn't make sense, but it wasn't actually the words of Pol Pot. That's what I mean with lost in translation.
The translation was done by Kiet Chun with Tuan Prasit in Ying Sari helping them. I don't think that would have been a mistake with those people, with Pol Pot.
Of course, I'm not here to speculate as to what Pol Pot possibly said, but would you agree with me that the conflict between DK and Vietnam became the centerpiece in U.S., therefore NATO, / Soviet relations?
Not NATO, it was U.S.-Chinese relations that were critical on this issue. Europe, NATO, no. This was U.S.-China, and that was very critical. And you see this particularly around Tiananmen Square. As you get closer and closer to that divide.
That was 1989.
Yeah, you asked.
I think your answer got lost.
You asked if this affected U.S. NATO, and I said no, this was much more important for U.S. Chinese. And it continues all the way up through Tiananmen Square. And you can see that U.S. policy towards Cambodia is very much determined by U.S. Chinese policy. NATO, no.
Because of time, I'll move on to the other conclusion on the border war between Vietnam and Cambodia. He's basically saying it started already in 1970. Both are at fault, and both are not necessarily acting irrational. Would you agree or disagree with that?
In 1970, the major change on the border was when the United States supported the coup against Sihanouk. The troops, the communist Vietnamese troops, both from the north and from the south, who had been confined to the eastern zones, they spread across the country. And the Vietnamese communist troops took the fight against the Lon Nol government so that the Khmer Rouge forces could build, could arm, and so on and so forth, so they could be ready to carry the fight on their own. That was the major change in Cambodian-Vietnamese military relations. So to call that a border war, no. It was very much the first, in fact, it was very surprising to many people that the Vietnamese communists picked up the slack. They won Chen La 1 campaign, they won the Chen La 2 campaign, and that's all the way across this country.
I would like to follow up on that, but I think I'll move on to the next line of questioning, and that is, we have been talking about the American perspective on Vietnamese ambitions. You basically said in the Chinese Federation, I don't think so. I would like now to read to you a passage coming from the Soviet archives, quoted in a book that we discussed earlier, a book by Stephen Morris, entitled Why Vietnam Invaded Cambodia. Specifically, Mrs. Becker, I would like to take you to page 66 of that book. That is ERN E307/5.2.4. I'm afraid, again, Mr. President, it's only English ERN 01001733. And Morris is quoting the Soviet ambassador to North Vietnam. And I read to you as follows, Ms. Becker. I will do it slowly so that translation can keep up. But this did not mean that Hanoi had abandoned entirely its desire for Indo-Chinese Federation. In February 1973, the Soviet ambassador to North Vietnam spelled out what he believed to be Hanoi's goals. And then the ambassador is quoted in the book. The program of the Vietnamese comrades for Indochina is to replace the reactionary regimes in Saigon, Vientiane and Phnom Penh with progressive ones. And later, when all Vietnam and also Laos and Cambodia start on the road to socialism. To move forward the establishment of a federation of the Indochinese countries. The course of the Vietnamese Workers' Party flows from the program of the former Communist Party of Indochina. So, Ms. Becker, my question would be, it seems that also the Soviets in 1973 still see Vietnamese policy in terms of creating an Indochinese federation. What would be your reaction on that?
Oh, I'm not surprised at all. As I said, it was a moving target. And depending on the period, it's whether or not different people and different parties saw that. Now, if you remember correctly, the Soviet Union had very poor relations with both sides of the Cambodian War. The Soviet kept their embassy in Phnom Penh throughout the war. And the first thing that one of the first things that the Khmer Rouge did was trash the Soviets, who thought they would be treated as allies. So it's a very tricky thing, but I'm not at all surprised. And you'll find references to this, from very different periods. But as I said, the most recent Soviet archive work, again, I'll repeat in the book Embers of War, traces, one, the Soviets having very little interest in Vietnam, Cambodia, or Laos, and not wanting to give much money. They were much more interested in Europe, and therefore very happy to have an Indochina Federation, kind of Indochinese party. And it was Ho Chi Minh who fought with them to have a separate Vietnam party.
I'll get back to Ho Chi Minh, but it seems, and maybe I just don't understand it correctly, but that Douglas Pike is accurately describing Vietnamese policy in relation to what the ambassador of the Soviet Union is saying about Vietnam's ambitions. So I don't see really any light between Douglas Pike on the one hand and the Soviet ambassador on the other hand.
Excuse me, Your Honor, that
President, the expert, please wait. And the international co-prosecutor, you can have the floor.
Your Honor, again, it sounds more like counsel's views rather than stating a question to the expert.
Well, at least I'm not touching only the surface, Mr. Prosecutor. I'm asking whether the views of the Soviet Union were in line with the perceptions and observations of Douglas Pike.
The interview with the Soviet ambassador is very interesting, and Douglas Pike has his views. Maybe the Soviet ambassador and Douglas Pike agree. You're absolutely right. But I don't know if we can call that American policy and Vietnamese policy and Soviet policy.
Well, if you allow me then, Mrs. Becker, let me now turn to how the Chinese saw the ambitions of Vietnam. And I would like to refer you to the earlier mentioned report of Geng Biao. That is E307/5.2.1, more particularly ERN 01001621. Now, just for your background information, because I didn't see it referenced in your book, this was a very high-level meeting in January '79. It was Central Committee, Standing Committee within China. It was a secret meeting. Geng Biao was the highest military person within China, reporting to, among others, Deng Xiaoping. So this is not a public version of China's views, but the perception of China itself on especially Vietnam. Now, as you know, I'm sure you know that Deng Xiaoping had referred to Vietnam already as the hooligans of the East. And Geng Biao seems to say the same thing, and I would like to quote to you. That is that ERN 01001621, and I quote, why did Vietnam not invade Cambodia when the diplomatic relations between them were broken off last year? Why has it waited until now to begin its aggression upon Cambodia? As a matter of fact, as early as before the liberation of South Vietnam, Vietnam had harbored malicious intentions. The small handful of its war maniacs, at the instigation of their social imperialist behind-the-scenes boss, had wanted to encroach on Cambodia, drawing it into the so-called Indochina alliance, and turning it into the springboard and base of social imperialism in its attempt to realize its global strategic plan and expand into Southeast Asia. My question would be, it's this view of China on Vietnam's ambitions seem also to correspond with the conclusions of Douglas Pike before U.S. Congress and Soviet views of Vietnamese policy. Would you agree?
Oh, that's maybe.
President, Mr. Expert, Madam Expert, please wait. And Judge Vance, you have the floor.
Councillor, you're doing it again. Presenting the opinion of one person as the opinion of the country is evaluating a piece of evidence you're putting forward. So please stop it.
I'm not sure if I understand, if I follow. We're talking Vietnamese foreign policy, and I'm putting forward foreign policy views of the US, the Soviet Union, and China. I'm just reading how they saw Vietnam, and I'm asking the expert opinion of Mrs. Becker. So that's what I'm supposed to do.
You're putting forward the opinions of individuals, not of countries. Whether these opinions accurately reflect the opinions of the country is something which has to be determined. It's an issue of language.
In respect of Douglas Pike, I agree there could be a discussion. However, in relation to this document, this is clearly Chinese policy. There's no doubt about that whatsoever. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure the expert will be able to correct me.
Si je peux me permettre, Maître Copé.
Counsel Copé, is this an official Chinese document? Has it been confirmed to be a Chinese document? This document was obtained, and we do not know under what circumstances it was obtained.
To be honest, I find it a little disappointing that after 7 years we still have to discuss the value and relevance of Geng Biao. All scholars are referring to this extremely important report. It is, without a doubt, the view of China, reflecting Chinese policy. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure the expert will correct me.
Council, there has been a ruling. Please adapt your language to it. That's the only thing we're asking you at this point in time.
Fine. Mrs. Becker, yes, I love to. Would you be able to tell Chinese policy in relation to what the Chinese views were, of Vietnamese policy toward DK, or toward Cambodia in general?
That totally reflects the public view. In fact, you'll see it in my book. The Chinese definitely accused Vietnam of wanting an Indo-Chinese federation, and that's one of the reasons they gave when they invaded Vietnam from the Chinese border and taught Vietnam a lesson with the invasion. That's no secret. And they very much use the Vietnamese desire for an Indo-Chinese Federation to say very publicly, it's a very public point, that they considered Vietnam going after an Indo-Chinese Federation. That's not a secret.
Then I think we agree,
Yeah,
Ms. Becker.
we agree.
Thank you very much for your answer.
President, the time is appropriate for a short break. We take a break now and return at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And court officer, please assist the expert during the break and have her return to the courtroom at 3 o'clock. The court is now in recess.